Yeah, so as I was saying, we're going to do eating disorders, and then we're going to have a presentation on disease, which will be led by our lovely secretary. And then I'll be doing a part on Oxford personal statements. So this would be helpful if you're trying to apply for Oxbridge or just in general. And yeah, so let's get started. Um, can we have Neha to come present our eating disorders, please?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, we're going to talk about something really important: eating disorders. Eating disorders are mental health conditions that involve an unhealthy relationship with food, body image, and eating behaviors. It's important to remember this isn't just about food. These issues often come from deeper emotional struggles like trauma, low self image, or feeling out of control. Anyone can be affected, no matter their age, gender, or background. Some of the most common types include anorexia nervosa, where someone restricts food intake due to a fear of gaining weight, bulimia nervosa, which involves cycles of binge eating followed by purging through vomiting or other methods, and binge eating disorder, where people eat large amounts of food in a short period, often feeling unable to stop and without purging. So, what causes eating disorders? There's no single reason. They're often the result of several overlapping factors. We have biological factors where genetics and hormonal imbalances can play a role, psychological traits like perfectionism, anxiety, or low self esteem that can increase the risk. Social and cultural influences like messages from media, diet culture, and societal expectations, which can have a huge impact. And trauma and life events like bullying, abuse, grief, or major stress that can all trigger disordered eating. A helpful phrase to remember is it's not about food, it's about feelings. Food may be the focus, but the root causes are emotional and psychological. Being able to recognize the signs of an eating disorder can help someone get support earlier. Physical signs can include sudden weight loss or weight gain, dizziness or constant fatigue, stomach or digestion issues, hair thinning or skin changes. Emotional and behavioral signs may include constant focus on food, weight, or exercise, skipping meals or developing rituals around eating, avoiding eating in front of others, feeling intense guilt after eating, and low self esteem or distorted body image. It's important to note that not everyone with an eating disorder will show all of these signs, and it is different for different people. End on a helpful note, though. Recovery is possible, even though it may not be a straight or easy journey. It often involves a combination of therapy, medical help, support from your community or family, and learning self acceptance. Getting help early can make a big difference, and it takes real courage to reach out. If you or someone you know is struggling, there is support available. For example, in the UK, you can contact a helpline, Beat Eating Orders. Remember, recovery is not only possible, it is worth it. Now I'm going to hand over to our guest speaker, Jess Way, who I again thank on behalf of ASN for being able to join us today and share her story.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Will you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so my name is Jess, and this is my story of how I'm overcoming mainly anorexia, but also depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So, next slide, please. So, what is an eating disorder? An eating disorder is a range of mental health conditions which there is a persistent disturbance of eating behavior and impairment of physical or mental health. And anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder and a serious mental health condition. So both men and women of any age can get anorexia, but it's most common in young women and typically starts in your mid teens. So there are many types of eating disorders. Anorexia isn't the only one, and they are all equally important as each other. So there's anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, ARFID, OFSED, and orthorexia. And actually, when people say, "Oh, I have an eating disorder," many people just think you just have anorexia, but actually, binge eating disorder is the most common eating disorder. Next slide, please. So let's bust some myths. So there are actually many myths surrounding eating disorders, but I just chose three that I've gone through. So the first one is eating disorders are a choice. So eating disorders are actually complex illnesses. There's no single cause, and they're thought to be caused by a combination of biological, psychological, and socio-cultural factors. The second one is someone must be underweight to have an eating disorder. So yeah, weight loss is typical in anorexia nervosa, but most people with an eating disorder will stay at a healthy weight. And if the person restores their weight, this is only one aspect of treatment, and being weight restored doesn't actually mean the person is recovered. The thoughts and behaviors that come alongside an eating disorder also have to be addressed, and this will take years and years of therapy. And actually, only less than 6% of people with an eating disorder are medically diagnosed as being underweight. And this last thing I cannot stress more, an eating disorder is a mental disorder and not a weight disorder. And then the last one is people can't recover from their illnesses in their genes. Although there is evidence that someone's genes can contribute to the risk of developing an eating disorder, it does not mean they cannot recover, because full recovery from an eating disorder is possible with the right help and support. Okay, a bit of my story. So I began struggling with PTSD from a previous relationship at 15. PTSD doesn't just co-occur with eating disorders, it often shapes them. And research shows that people with PTSD are significantly more likely to experience an eating disorder. Why? Because trauma lives in the body and food becomes a way to cope when the body doesn't feel safe. So in my case, restriction created a sense of control. I was diagnosed with anorexia in March 2022 and then depression, anxiety, and PTSD in November 2022. When I was diagnosed, I was like, no, this can't be real. And I continued to decline physically and mentally. And I began to shut everyone around me and started refusing help. And eating disorder is very good at making itself seem like a friend who's there for your worst days. It's like a safety blanket. But in reality, it just wants the worst for you and it won't stop until it's too late. So in November 2023, I was admitted into a specialist eating disorder inpatient unit 1 hour from home. I stayed there for 4 months and I was out of school for 5 months. I also taught myself 5 months of A levels, which was not very nice. It was the hardest battle I had to face, but from the moment I stepped foot into hospital, I realised that I could be the only one that could change my future. Yes, the system does need changing, but you can also change for the better. From there, I worked on overcoming my habits and worked on developing healthier coping strategies, and I was discharged in March 2024. So this next slide is not to glamorize hospital, because hospital shouldn't be glamorized, but there was this one good thing about hospital was the amazing staff members that they gave me the best advice. So there's some of their quotes on there. I also met one of my best friends in hospital, and her name is Maddie, and we still meet up to this day. She's now discharged from all mental health services, and that's my goal. The next slide has a before and after photo of us from not choosing recovery to actually committing ourselves, and you can see the difference in our smiles. So the left photo was us going out for a supported snack with the occupational therapist in the middle of our admission, and the right side photo was us at Lana Del Rey a couple of weeks ago. And you can just see the difference in our happiness, our smiles, the lights back in our eyes. And when people called us chronic and told us that we would never have a chance of recovering, they were all wrong. And please, if you know anyone struggling, tell them there is light at the end of the tunnel, because just look at us two, for example. So these are some of my reasons to recover. I wrote this in hospital with my therapist about 2 weeks into my admission, and I actually told her, I was like, you do realize this is stupid. I'm not gonna be able to achieve any of these. A year and a bit on, I have done 11 out of the 15. So the ones that ticks are the ones I've done. And it wasn't until I was doing this PowerPoint I was ticking them off and I was like, whoa, okay, I've actually done quite a lot because I genuinely thought when I came out of hospital, I would just relapse and they'll see me again 2 weeks later, but they didn't. Next slide, please. Okay, so the lessons I have learned along the way. So I'm just going to talk about healing isn't linear, and that's okay for a bit. So recovery will never be linear. It's not easy. And there will be days where you feel like, oh, you can't do this. But I tell myself that the days in recovery are better than days in relapse. And I had to pull myself out of multiple relapses after I was discharged from hospital. And I'm glad I did that because I'm now living the life I want to live. And then recovery is also not possible, is not just possible, it's worth it. So these are some of my favorite recovery quotes. I actually had these stuck on my wall in hospital, and I do still have them stuck on my wall. So you're not failing at your eating disorder, you're succeeding in recovery. You can survive without your eating disorder. Your eating disorder cannot survive without you. Remember the moments where recovery feels the most painful and often the ones you are making the most progress because it indicates you're actively trying to challenge your demons, keep on pushing forward, even when the eating disorder voice screams at you. Things tend to scream when dying. And my worst days in recovery are better than the best days in relapse. So to end, just some facts. So up to 70 million people have an eating disorder. 10,200 deaths are caused by EDs all year. People with anorexia are 5 times more likely to die prematurely. Only 21% with anorexia make a full recovery, but this doesn't mean that recovery isn't possible, and I, as well as many others, will continue to prove the system wrong. So thank you to listening to part of my story, and thank you for having me. I hope it gave you an informative and perspective into my recovery journey. So I thought to finish, here are some photos that show the before and after of myself committing recovery. And if there's any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was so informative, and I know it's really helpful for us as young people right now. Now I'd like to, obviously, if you have any questions for Jess, just leave them in the chat and then she'll get back to you, hopefully. Now I'd like to hand over to Letitia, who is going to be doing this presentation for us.
Hello everyone. So for the portion of the seminar that all of you voted for, so most of you voted for seeing Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, that's what we are going to be looking at today. So the name might sound a little bit strange, but the disease actually is quite a rare brain degenerative disorder essentially. So it is a neurological disorder, as mentioned here, which is quite rare. It actually happens only about for every million people that you have, only about 1 to 2 or 3 people actually are diagnosed with this disease. So in short, what is this disease? It's, as I mentioned earlier, a rare brain disorder which leads to the onset of dementia. So there is a group of diseases we have which are known as the prion diseases, which happens in both humans and animals. And the one that happens mostly in humans is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which we know as CJD. A known prion disease which occurs in animals is mad cow's disease, which is medically known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Now, unfortunately, CJD does not have a cure as of far. If anyone's been diagnosed with CJD, it will always be fatal. There is no cure for the disease. The only option for people who are diagnosed with this is treatment and palliative care, which we will look at more in the next slide. So there's actually quite a lot of different types of CJD, as we can see here, but the most common form of CJD, which is mentioned in the first option, is sporadic CJD. It might be quite surprising actually, but sporadic CJD has no known cause. It occurs spontaneously. There is no known cause that scientists have been able to found, and it occurs mostly in people who are older, so around 50 to 75. Sporadic CJD also has a much faster progression compared to other forms of CJD, which means that death usually occurs much faster. Then we have genetic or familial CJD, which, as the name suggests, occurs due to genetic causes. And the reason why there is a mutation is unknown. But if one of your parents has a mutation for this gene, there is a 50-50 chance that the offspring or the child will also have this disease. So this mutation occurs in a gene that produces a prion protein, which we will look at later on, what the prion protein exactly is. But if you've studied A-level biology, you may have studied about autosomal dominant inheritance, which means that this disease is caused by a dominant allele, which means if one of your parents has the mutation, there is a 50% chance that you also might have this mutation. So as mentioned here, you only need to inherit one of the mutated genes in order to develop this condition. Then we have iatrogenic and variant CJD. Now, the common thing about both of these forms of CJD is they're actually caused by infection or contamination, you could say. So iatrogenic CJD is actually caused by accidental transmission through medical or surgical procedures. So it's actually very rare. Sporadic is the most common form. Iatrogenic is quite rare. So one way you can get it is when, for example, some people may be treated with growth hormones, such as pituitary growth hormones. And some of these hormones can actually come from an infected person who might have CJD. So this can transmit CJD on to the person who's receiving the growth hormones. The other option is transplant. So recipients who may have cornea transplants, which is the outer layer of your eye, or dura mater transplants, grafts, which the dura mater is actually a membrane that lines the skull, as mentioned here. The third way, which is actually quite rare, is when doctors or surgeons use surgical equipment which can be contaminated. Maybe they're reusing devices on the brains of patients, and that can be contaminated, so it can transmit it onto the person. The last form of CJD is actually quite unique from the rest, which is variant CJD, because this is actually caused when someone eats contaminated meat. So it comes from cattle which have been infected by the disease we looked at earlier, mad cow disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. And this actually has a younger onset, so people who are in their 20s, 30s will usually show symptoms for the disease, but it tends to last longer, so people tend to die much later compared to sporadic CJD. When you examine the brains of people with variant CJD after their death, you can see that they will have a distinctive appearance which can be used to distinguish it from other types of CJD. So now, as I mentioned earlier, prions, this is what the cause of CJD is. So there's actually a type of protein in our brains and nerve cells, which are known as normal prion proteins. They're found in almost all body tissues, but are at higher levels in your brains and your nerve cells. Now, the exact role of what these proteins are is unknown, but it is thought that they might play a role in transporting messages between certain brain cells. Now, sometimes, for unknown reasons, mistakes can occur during the folding of this protein, and as a result, it cannot be used by the body. Now, when these prion proteins misfold, they tend to be recycled by the body, but sometimes they can build up in the brain if they aren't recycled, and this will cause other prion proteins to misfold. And essentially, this misfolding is what causes CJD. So brain cells will die, and this will cause more prions to infect other brain cells. Now, because of this, eventually clusters of brain cells are killed, and deposits of misfolded prion proteins called plaques may appear in the brain, which will be visible on MRI scans. They can also cause small holes to develop in the brain, sort of like sponge-like, which is why we call it spongiform. And because of the damage that's caused to the brain in this disease, it can cause both physical and mental impairments, and eventually, unfortunately, will lead to death. Prions can survive in nerve tissue, which is our brain or spinal cord, for a very long time, even after death. Now we'll look at the symptoms of the disease. So as we mentioned, there are both physical and mental impairments. So we have both physiological and psychological symptoms for this disease. So initial neurological symptoms, which will show up earlier on in the onset of the disease for sporadic CJD, can include difficulty walking, so problems with your balance, your movement, slurred speech, difficulty with your eyesight, so dizziness, numbness or pins and needle sensations in parts of the body, and hallucinations, which are actually pretty similar to symptoms in diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Psychological symptoms of variant CJD, the initial symptoms can include severe depression, withdrawal from family, friends, the world around you, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, which is difficulty sleeping. Advanced symptoms, which actually occur later on in the disease for neurological, include loss of bladder control, bowel control, blindness, swallowing difficulties. So patients may have to use food tubes in order to be able to swallow easily. And for patients who have loss of bladder control, you may have to use catheters in order to urinate. Loss of speech, difficulty speaking, loss of voluntary movement. And advanced psychological symptoms for all forms of CJD include loss of memory, feeling agitated, aggressive behavior, loss of appetite, and because of an infection, the reason why patients die once they get CJD is because over time they become immobile, so they cannot move and become bedridden. And because of this, they're more prone to infections that affect the lungs, like pneumonia, respiratory failure, and as a result, patients end up dying. Now we're going to look at how it's diagnosed. So there's actually different ways that you can diagnose this disease. The first one is a neurological examination, so that is identifying changes in reflexes, muscle twitching, spasms, any movement problems, coordination, vision problems, etc. But the main problem with this form of examination is that some of these symptoms may be common for other diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, so we go for more advanced techniques like an EEG, which is an electroencephalography. So they essentially place electrodes on your brain, and these electrodes record any electrical signals in your brain. And any sort of, you could say, abnormality in the electrical patterns can be used to identify CJD. Then we have MRI scans, which use magnetic fields and radio waves to create detailed images of the brain, and they can detect changes like we mentioned earlier, plaques, which are deposits of the prion protein. They can be identified in the MRI scans, and this usually can be seen in about 90% of CJD cases. Then we have more advanced models like cerebrospinal fluid tests, where they use a lumbar puncture to extract some fluid, you could say, from the spinal cord, and they test it for presence of proteins that are seen in CJD. We also have a newer test called an RT-QIC, which is a more specific test for prion disease and can detect prions that cause CJD. The only way to confirm a diagnosis is by a brain biopsy or an autopsy, where the brain is examined after death. Brain biopsies are rarely carried out now because they involve removing a part of the brain to be examined by a neuropathologist, but it is dangerous because it can cause infections and several other complications, so it's very rarely performed. In an autopsy, when a person dies after their death, their brain can be examined. We will now look at some of the treatment, where actually there is no treatment. There is no cure for this disease, unfortunately. Most of these cases are fatal, so almost within a couple of months or a year after diagnosis, patients with CJD end up dying. Genetic CJD is an exception though, because it has an earlier onset, but patients usually tend to die after a much longer period of time. So it has a slower progression compared to other forms of diseases. But unfortunately, since there is no cure, treatment mainly involves alleviating symptoms, providing drugs to ease movement issues, blindness issues, any eating problems that may arise. As we have heard, palliative care, end-of-life care is provided to patients to ensure they can pass as comfortably as possible and to help them have an easier experience of the symptoms. Here are some sources, some websites that you may want to look at, but that was all for my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Letitia. Now we'll be moving on to Oxford Personal Statement. So this was taken from the Anatomy of a Personal Statement, which you could find on the Oxford website. But yeah, let's get started. So some disclaimers that I have is that Oxford prefers a unique personal statement to you to express your personality and individuality. So they want to learn more about you as a person because they will already have like your academic qualifications like a UCAT and your GCSE and your predicted grades. They will already be given that. So a personal statement, the point of it is to show yourself, like who you are as a person and why that aligns with a medical career, in your opinion. And so Oxford obviously prioritizes your grades, and this goes for any top-end university like Oxbridge and UCL. And so they prioritize your grades more, which is why they use your GCSEs and your UCAT result to shortlist you predominantly. And then they use the personal statement to differentiate between two really close academic candidates. So they will look at which personal statement aligns with them better, and then they will invite that person for the interview. So if your GCSEs and your UCAT are not very strong, then it would be pointless to apply to Oxbridge, because you will have a very slim chance of getting invited for an interview. So on the side of the screen, I've got the distribution of raw UCAT marks. So here you can see like they have been interviewed at 2,900 onwards. So if you have a UCAT of 2,900, you would be considering to apply to Oxbridge to have a fair chance at securing a place. And then obviously for Oxbridge, you need grade 9 and 8 majority for your GCSEs. So here we can see that the average you need, like, to get a very, very strong chance of getting an interview and a place is about 9 GCSEs. So 9 and onwards is what is considered like acceptable in a sense for Oxford if you want to apply. And so selection criteria, you can find this in on the website as well. And this is basically a part they want you to include and like draw insights to in your personal statement. So if you mention empathy, you mention how you gained motivation, communication, honesty, and integrity, ethical awareness, ability to work with others, so like teamwork, and the capacity for sustained and intense work, problem solving, intellectual curiosity and communication skills. That's the things that you need to include in your personal statement. So maybe you would look at certain events or certain work experiences or volunteering events that you've been to, and that how they show that you have, selection, like you have the attributes they need for a student at Oxford. And so to start the personal statement, this is obviously taken from the Anatomy of a Personal Statement. And to start it, you should probably start with a view on medicine, or what medicine means to you. So be honest with your perception of medicine and don't try to be showy or over exaggerate your opinion, because as this shows here, as the admissions tutor shows here, it does make the admissions tutor a little bit a spectacle of your views from the get-go. So like it should express medicine in a way, like what you think medicine is, but it shouldn't be over the top where you're like, oh yeah, I've always been wanting to go into medicine. Well, that may be the case for people, but just make it not so overpowering, if you get what I mean. And then so mentioning your work experience. So obviously they won't judge you for what you've done, what type of placements you've gotten. Like they just want to know what you learned from it. So the description shouldn't be over exaggerated. And then it should only be explained enough so then they can understand the insight each opportunity provided you. And it needs to be relatively detailed, but not too detailed. So it's like you need to be at a sweet spot with how much you describe, how much you add, because you only have an A4 size page to write, to present your view yourself to an admissions tutor, right? So you need to be very selective with what you write. And then it also needs to suggest an intellectual curiosity while mentioning your work experience, your, events that you took out from your work experience does show intellectual curiosity. It shows curiosity for medicine, for learning, and also importance of good communication skills. So you need to reflect on how work experience changed your perspective of medicine, how it made it evolve, perhaps. And so it needs to show the admissions team that you were motivated to learn more about the field, and from your curiosity and willingness to learn, but do not go off on a tangent. And so you may have done some volunteering, maybe some jobs on the side. So this needs to show like an impression of engagement and intellectual curiosity. So whenever you describe a work experience, you just need to show that you have like curiosity and you want to do whatever you're doing. Um, and so the other side of medicine, so you need to include an account of medicine that shows that you're well informed about the realities of healthcare. So this person, they did talk about, the attention that that they provided to the unpleasant side of medicine. So they went on a work experience, they volunteered at a care home, and then that showed them that medicine is not all fun and games and that it is quite unpleasant. There is a, dark side to medicine. And it also like exposed them to the stark realities of the medical field. And also it shows a sense of empathy because this person said stark realities of physical aging and senility. So that shows that they have an empathy for patients, and that's obviously a very important attribute to have as a doctor. And it just needs to show, and as this admissions tutor says, it reaffirms the applicant's motivation for medicine, and it is evident of like analytical skills that they have, which shows that they are well informed about the field of medicine and that they are ready to embark on this challenge, even though they know it's going to be hard. And so empathy obviously comes across because the applicant is recognizing that a brief interaction could have such a positive effect on the overlooked residents of the home. And so they just want to see your perspective of medicine is realistic and that you're aware of all the challenges in medicine because it shows that your motivation to apply and to study medicine is genuine and you're not just, you just, not after all the glamour. You know that it's a hard field. Mentioning extracurriculars is a good idea as well, and this might put some of you to ease, especially for unis that are so competitive. They did say in here, like the applicant, they enjoyed doing, doing drama, and they were a member of a local group for 6 years. They did cycling, playing the guitar, and piano, which helped them relax. So you need to show that you have hobbies outside of academics and that you have some sort of coping mechanism that helps you, deal with the stress and workload that is put on you during your sixth form and during your GCSE years. Um, and so it needs to show that you have a wider spare time interest and that you can work with others. So this person obviously volunteered and also did a couple jobs. So that shows that, they have teamwork, which is especially important because especially in Oxbridge, you have a tutorial system where you're paired with like five, six students, fellow students, and you have a tutor that's leading you. Um, and you go over the lectures in that group. So you need to be very like open to teamwork if you want to, apply to Oxbridge, and you obviously need to have a capacity for sustained and intense work, not only just for Oxbridge, but for every other medical field, but especially for Oxbridge because the workload is very intense. And it also shows that they have good time management because they're managing all of this and, having really good academic scores. And yeah, they did said that These non-academic interests don't need to be particularly high-powered ones. So it just needs to be something that shows that you have a work-life balance and that you understand it's very important to relax. So it doesn't need to be like, you don't need to be an absolute musician, you don't need to be an athlete as your extracurricular. You just need to be, you just need to show that you have a life outside of medicine, outside of studying, and that you can have a work-life balance. So, how to end a personal statement? This person decided to talk more about the stark realities of medicine, and that it's not just a glamorous source of money, but it is, it shows that they know that becoming a medic will involve inherent sacrifice, and that is a good way to end. But then they did talk about the dark side, if you must say, of medicine. And then they talked about how it's a very deeply gratifying and fascinating career path. And so that shows that they know that, it's hard, but they want to do it, and that it's a very stimulating career, as they put in the personal statement. And then they ended with a few personal attributes that shows that they're well suited to medicine. So here they said, I know I have the enthusiasm, capacity for hard work, and the open and inquiring mind needed to succeed in a fulfilling vocation. So just comment on what you think about a career in medicine, and how work experience and volunteering changed your view of medicine, if that happened. Maybe you already knew that, medicine was a hard field, but you would like to go into it, maybe because your parents were doctors, or, you had extensive experience with healthcare, and then reaffirm how you would be a suitable person for a career in medicine by talking about your personality, by talking about your work ethic, and that's a good way. And then they did talk about for improvement. They did not talk about any scientific subjects that they're studying in school, and they didn't talk about any particular modules that an applicant might have found particularly exciting. And so this could have helped them convey enthusiasm and curiosity in science, and also willingness to learn. But I guess that is shown through their academic scores, which the uni will get. Um, and although they do assert that they have an open and inquiring mind, there's no, like, explicit description of any extracurricular project or reading or research that the applicant might have undertaken. So you do need to talk about how you are portraying a very, very deep interest in science and medicine. And so it does further, like, besides those omissions, this is an effective personal statement because it's well constructed and it connects with the reader, and the material flows in a logical sense. So you need to make sure that it's structured well. A good way would be to obviously do your view on medicine, then talk about your work experience, then maybe have a paragraph about some research that you may have done, or maybe a story that really, stuck with you, maybe a book that you read about medicine, maybe something like This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay. And just talking about that might show that you're definitely very interested and you have the enthusiasm for medicine, and that you've done the research about it. And so then they're not applying with a naive view about medicine, and that you have a good foundation for studying medicine. And even though all of this is there, a personal statement like this does still offer a lot of material that can be discussed at an interview. So conclusions, this was also taken from the Oxford website. Do not be shy in declaring any mitigating circumstances. So that means maybe you had an illness, maybe you couldn't go to couldn't go to school because of an illness, maybe a mental health issue, or I don't know, maybe family issues, domestic problems. And that might help the admissions tutor know you as a person, and that might show why you may have underperformed in certain exams, and that also builds a sort of like connection with you and the admissions tutor, which would be really helpful. And do not simply recount everything that you've ever undertaken. So don't just, put everything in. It's more about the quality than the quantity. You should be talking about experiences that really shaped your opinion on medicine and really, really made you want to pursue medicine as a career. And you, as they very, very carefully stressed, that they want to learn more about you as a person, not just your academic qualifications. And the selection criteria that I mentioned previously, they want you to directly address experiences where you have gained that selection criteria, those certain attributes in your personal statement. And obviously, you won't be alone in trying to, have us open your personal statement with a very attention-grabbing intro. So you should do it in a way that's unique to you, that, that resonates with you the most. Don't try to obviously plagiarize, because if they find that out, it will, ruin your medical career, even if you are a student. And so it's called personal for a reason. It's to show why medicine resonates with you. And there's no precise template to follow that will score you all the points. So something that's unique, something that's individual to you is what they prefer. So they want uniqueness, if that makes sense. Okay, I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, please let them, put them in the chat, and I'll send in the attendance form link. Please fill that up. And yeah, thank you so much for listening.